This is Duke University.
Our first speaker is Professor David Crowe of Elon University. He is professor there professor for history and legal history also at the School of Law. He is a prolific Central European historian focusing on the Roma, has received several prizes for his work, and testified before the US, Canadian, and international bodies on Roma policymaking. The title of his presentations is Chains and Shadows, a History of the Roma in Romania. Professor Crowe, please.
Since so much of the Romanian Roma personality and stigmas attached to their being is associated with the centuries and centuries and centuries of slavery, I think it's apropos to mention that, particularly for those of you not from this part of the country or this part of the United States, first about John Hope Franklin, and then when we're at Wake Forest, another prominent African-American intellectual and scholar, Angela Mayu. They were both, if you go back and look at John Hope's, I knew him fairly well, and Maya's background, if you go back into the 50s and 60s, they were very deeply involved in the American Civil Rights Movement. And I was too. In fact, my touchstone of comparison very frequently for what the Roma have gone through particularly since 1989, but historically even deeper than that in Romania, since we're talking about a slave system that goes back to the late Middle Ages. I think it's quite appropriate to mention these two individuals in large part because they represent the elite of American intellectualism, and I think have very much cast a brightest star, you might say, on not only Duke University, and also Wake Forest University. And of course, even though they've both passed away now, their spirit is still very much with us. And I think those of us that live in this area are very proud of that. Very quickly, most of what I've got to say, I'm sure you already know. So this is just basically an overview. And not that the enslavement of Roma is unique in the Balkans, it's certainly not. But I think in the case of Romania, which is of course the largest population, estimates are in the neighborhood of 1.8 to 2.5 million, is they were made slaves almost from the moment they entered Romania, or Wallachia and Moldavia in the late Middle Ages, and were not emancipated until the 1860s. And if you read American slave accounts and if you read Roma slave accounts, it's shocking how identical they are. Slavery in its worst form is horrid. And so in that context, African Americans and Roma, have shared that mutual experience. After they were emancipated, most of them remained as indentured servants, for lack of a better word, you might say, either on the estates of their former owners, or many of them had been owned by monasteries. And so you really don't see much in looking through that period. You really don't see much in terms of change from the status of being at the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. The lowest thing after a poor Romanian peasant was a Roma. The only bright spot you can talk about comes in the interwar period, 1918, 1939, when you do get finally an intellectual awakening among some Roma. And for those who have written about that period and looking back, say in 1939, some of the Roma observers looking back over the period, they talk about the fact that you have some dramatic changes. You have Roma organizations being formed. You have Roma moving into positions as doctors and teachers, not a large number, but you do begin to see developing in Romania a very, very unique intellectual base. Much of this is lost during World War II because, as you know, Antonescu and his followers pretty much in many ways out-Nazi'd the Nazis when it came to racial issues. He simply said in 1942 that there were going to be no minority issues. And the first victims, of course, were the Jews. And the second category were, of course, the Roma. almost the entire Romanian army invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 with the Germans. And they wrought the same horror in Crimea and Ukraine that the Germans were initiating to the north. They set up in 41-42 Transnistria, which was essentially set up as a killing ground for Jews. But in 42-43, they began to send Roma there. And estimates are that of the 300,000 plus Roma in Romania during World War II, about 10% or more died as a result of fascist policies. You had a gradual transition from attempts at democracy until the communists actually took over in 47, 48. And at first, the communists basically said, they looked at the Roma and said, we understand how you've been mistreated. Join the Communist Party, join the communist movement. We're going to be your saving grace. Well, as you would expect, that didn't work out. So what you basically have, say, from the late 1940s, really until the mid-1960s, is this on-again, off-again emphasis on Romanian nationalism. It was so strong, for example, that in the 1948 census, you had a dramatic drop in number of Roma who actually, by language, identified themselves as such, because the emphasis of the new communist government was Romanization. And this went back and forth until by 1956, the census, you suddenly see Roma redeclaring themselves Roma. By 1956, 1966, once again, the numbers drop because there's been a re-emphasis on Romanization and so forth. 65, Ceausescu comes in, and we know he was no darling. And he basically said there's just no Roma problem. It's just not being discussed. And he also emphasized the question of Romanization and so forth, and just said there simply is no minority issue. By the late 70s, though, as the Romanian economy is essentially coming apart, the Roma problem begins to bubble to the surface. And it's things that Angela just mentioned, the same problems that you see Roma experiencing in Eastern Europe today, they're experiencing back in the 60s and 70s. They're at the lowest rung or below the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder. They live in deep poverty. I remember doing a case a few years ago, an asylum case for a Roma whose father was pure-blooded Roma. He was an Air Force general, late 1970s. But how he had achieved that was by hiding the fact that he was a Roma. In other words, he was that you crossed over and you sort of turned your back on your ethnic background if you could get away with it. But by the late 70s, you begin to see that it's such the problem of the Roma, their deep poverty, lack of education, everything you identify today as core Roma access to housing, I mean everything. The Ceausescu regime actually began to address, set up a committee of demography, and they're trying to sort of figure out, we've got this huge Roma population in the neighborhood of 300,000 to 400,000, probably more. This is something that needs to be addressed. And it's interesting that in evaluating what needed to be done for the Roma, it's pretty much what you see today. I mean, nothing in that context in terms of the core needs of the Roma has really changed. What's interesting, though, is that they would initiate these studies. They would begin to, sedentarization was the big theme, and the other was obeying the law. Education was also put on the agenda. But in doing all of this, or at least attempting to do it, they were never got very much off the ground. The government would always then talk about the fact that the Roma are the cause of their own problems. And if they would just learn to behave, if they would learn to obey the law, that all of this would change. So on the one hand, they're attempting to do positive things, settle them down, moving them into high-rise apartment buildings, all this and that, putting a lot of money that Romania theoretically did not have into this issue. But at the same time, instead of identifying the core reasons for all of this, they simply put the onus on the Roma themselves, which totally neutralizes it and also fortifies the stereotypes of the Roma among the Roma public, which is the single biggest problem that the Roma face in Romania today, and I suspect probably all over Eastern Europe. Well, when Ceausescu, as you know, was overthrown in late 1989, and he and his wife Elena are executed, By early 1990, what you have is the Romanian press, in attacking the Ceausescus, accused both of them of being Roma. And this tends to fortify that. I mean, the worst thing you could call them was to call them Roma. And this is the new television, newspapers, things like that. And you have in 1990, 1991, 1992, you have this wave of violence sweeping Romanian Roma communities, and it's just extremely indiscriminate. And I know in many of the cases I've handled, particularly asylum cases, but not always, of Roma from Romania, up until about, I would say, 2008, 2009, you could so easily the internet, the INS, our INS, of course, has the same prejudice towards Roma that you find in Europe, that you would have a resistant INS judge reviewing a Romanian Roma case. And it was so easy to document the discrimination. In other words, in terms of, by and large, to get asylum in this country, you have to be able to prove that if you send that person back, they will suffer physical, psychological, or economic harm. And that was never difficult to prove in any sort of the cases I dealt with in, say, the first decade or first 15 years after the collapse of the regime. Now, in Romania itself, not a lot is being done, not really as much as being done by the government to really address much of anything until the early 2000s. And in 2003, there was a meeting of 9 states that had significant Roma populations in Europe. And by 2005, this will lead to the creation of the Decade of Roma Inclusion. Simultaneous with that was also the fact that Romania is also applying for EU membership. And is it? Okay. So anyhow, well, the bottom line is with Romania is, as Angela said, the first decade of Roma inclusion is mixed. And even the EU has said that in many cases the Roma situation of the Roma is actually worse now than it was when the decade of Roma inclusion began. And so I'll stop here, and then if we can perhaps talk more in depth about things in the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Crowe.